Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the most brutal chapters in American frontier history, the hard winter of 1880. The season when settlers on the northern plains learned what it meant to battle against nature itself. This was the winter when families, cut off from supplies and buried under relentless storms, did the unthinkable just to stay alive. They burned hay for heat. They rationed scraps of food like treasure. And every single day was a test of endurance. Before we get started, if you enjoy stories that bring history to life and uncover what people truly went through, make sure to give this video a like and hit follow. It really helps us keep these stories alive. Now, let's set the scene. Imagine the Dakota Territory in late 1880. Settlers had just finished the fall harvest and were preparing for what they thought would be an ordinary prairie winter. They stocked firewood, filled root cellars with potatoes and carrots, salted meat, and stacked hay for their livestock. But nothing could prepare them for what was coming. By mid-October, the first blizzards swept across the plains earlier than anyone expected. Snow piled up so fast that wagon roads disappeared. Settlers who planned to make one last supply trip to town suddenly found themselves trapped. Train lines were buried in drifts 20 feet high. Telegraph wires snapped, and the prairie world grew silent except for the sound of the wind. The cold wasn't just cold, it was relentless. Temperatures plunged and stayed there, day after day, week after week. Fires had to be kept burning constantly, but wood supplies dwindled quickly. Families turned to hay, twisting bundles of it to feed into stoves. Can you picture the desperation? Hay wasn't meant for burning. It smoked, smoldered, gave little heat, but it was all they had. Every armful tossed into the fire meant less food for the animals. But without it, the family inside would freeze. Mornings were always the hardest. The settlers woke to frost coating the inside of their cabins, their breath forming clouds in the dim light. Windows were etched with delicate crystals, beautiful but merciless reminders of the cold pressing in. Floors were stiff underfoot, boots frozen solid if they'd been left too close to the door. Parents shook children awake, wrapped them tighter in quilts, and forced stiff fingers into mittens. Breakfast wasn't about taste or variety, it was about survival. Thin porridge, stretched with the last handfuls of flour, flavored with dried berries if they were lucky. A strip of jerky, cut small, maybe shared between 3 children. Every bite was measured. Every spoonful was stretched as far as possible. Families sat in silence, saving their strength for the long day ahead. Outside, the prairie was transformed. Snow drifts rose like frozen cliffs, sculpted by the wind into ridges that shifted daily. Paths carved yesterday were gone today. Settlers had to forge new ones each morning, crunching across hard-packed snow that bit through their boots. The landscape was both dazzling and terrifying, a sea of white that seemed endless, a world where horizons vanished and landmarks disappeared. The animals suffered alongside the people. Horses stamped in their stalls, shivering despite blankets thrown over them. Their breath rose in clouds, their flanks thin beneath winter's grip. Cows huddled in corners of barns, lowing softly, pressing against one another for warmth. Chickens tucked themselves deep into straw, feathers puffed, barely moving. Settlers faced impossible choices: feed the livestock and risk freezing in their cabins, or burn the hay and watch their animals starve. Each handful of hay became a question of survival. Evenings brought fragile comfort. Families gathered around the stove, the fire burning low, embers glowing faintly. Shadows danced across log walls. Mothers sewed by firelight, humming softly to steady the children's nerves. Fathers told stories of warmer days, tales of fields in bloom and rivers running free. Children whispered dreams of spring, eyes wide, imaginations alive even as the storm rattled the shutters. These moments of togetherness were more than routine, they were lifelines. But the storms didn't stop. Week after week, the blizzards returned. Snow piled higher, blocking doors, burying fences, and sealing cabins in silence. The weight of winter wasn't just outside, it pressed into the hearts of every settler, reminding them that survival wasn't guaranteed. Each morning they rose with stiff joints. Each night they fell asleep wondering if the fire would hold until dawn. The settlers learned to measure their days, not by the sun, it barely rose above the horizon, but by the rhythm of survival. Morning was firewood or hay for the stove. Midday meant checking livestock, breaking ice in buckets, rationing what little food remained. Evening was about holding on to warmth, holding on to hope. And through it all, they discovered something unexpected. Even in the harshest conditions, even when every comfort was stripped away, the human spirit found ways to endure. A carved toy from a scrap of wood. A song hummed softly in the dark. A story passed from parent to child. These weren't luxuries, they were survival too. The winter of 1880 would stretch on for months, longer than anyone thought possible. But in that endless frozen silence, families discovered resilience they didn't know they had. And that's where we'll pause for now. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into how these settlers adapted as February arrived. When the cold grew even sharper, supplies ran dangerously low, and every choice carried heavier consequences. When February rolled in, the settlers had already been trapped for months, and the cold wasn't letting up. Hey guys, welcome back. If you've been following this journey, you know the hard winter of 1880 was nothing short of brutal. And if you're new here, make sure to hit like and follow so you don't miss the rest of this story, because things are about to get even harsher. By now, survival was no longer about waiting out a storm. It was about living inside one that never seemed to end. Snowdrifts towered taller than men. Roofs sagged under the weight. Paths to the barn or the well had to be dug anew every single morning, only to vanish again by nightfall. Imagine waking up, opening the door, and seeing a solid wall of snow where your yard used to be. That was the daily reality. Inside the cabins, warmth was fleeting. Families had long since burned through their wood piles. They twisted hay into makeshift bundles, feeding it into the stoves. It didn't burn hot, it didn't burn long, and it filled the rooms with acrid smoke, but it kept the frost from claiming them. The smell of burning hay, faintly sweet and earthy, became the scent of survival. Meals grew thinner, too. Porridge watery and bland, flavored only with a few dried berries or a pinch of salt. A strip of jerky, cut into slivers so small that children were told to chew slowly, savoring each bite. Bread hardened by months of storage was soaked in hot water just to make it edible. Parents went hungry so their children could eat, whispering encouragement while their own stomachs ached. And yet, in those meager meals, there was ritual. Breakfast wasn't just food, it was reassurance. It was a promise that as long as something warm could be ladled into bowls, the family was still holding on. Around the fire, spoons scraped gently against tin bowls, the sound echoing in the silence of snow pressing outside. The animals, too, bore the weight of this winter. Horses stamped their hooves in frozen stalls, restless and thin. Cows huddled together, their low moans carrying through the barns like mournful songs. Chickens barely moved, puffed into balls of feathers, alive but fragile. Each handful of hay thrown to them was a painful calculation. Do we keep them alive for spring, or do we burn it tonight so we can live through till morning? And the storms kept coming. Blizzard after blizzard roared across the plains, howling winds piling snow into ridges that looked like frozen oceans. Visibility shrank to nothing. People could get lost between the cabin and the barn, a distance of just a few yards, and never make it back. To survive, settlers strung ropes between buildings, gripping them tight as lifelines through blinding whiteouts. Evenings were a mix of exhaustion and fragile comfort. Families gathered around the dim glow of their stoves, huddled so close their shoulders touched. Shadows flickered across log walls. Mothers stitched and mended by the faint light, humming lullabies to steady nerves. Fathers carved toys from scraps of wood, smoothing them for small hands. Children whispered stories of green fields and warm rivers, their imaginations carrying them far from the frozen silence outside. But the nights were long. The wind never seemed to rest, pressing against cabins, rattling shutters, whistling through cracks in the walls. Fires burned low, embers glowing faintly, and parents lay awake listening for the fire's hiss, for the creak of the roof under snow, for the sound of their children's steady breathing. Sleep was never deep, never peaceful. It was just enough to rise again and face another day. By mid-February, the settlers had grown intimate with the cold. It wasn't just outside, it lived in their bones. Joints stiffened, breath curled visibly in the cabin air, frost-etched windows in delicate patterns that looked like lace. Each morning meant stiff fingers struggling with boots, numb hands fumbling with buckets of ice. Every task took twice the time and twice the strength. And yet, resilience grew alongside hardship. Families learned to adapt, to make do. Hay wasn't just fuel, it was insulation, stuffed into cracks in the walls, layered under blankets for extra warmth. Root, vegetables, wrinkled and fading, were boiled into thin stews that still managed to fill bellies. Quilts were patched and repatched, scraps of fabric stitched together into blankets that told the story of endurance one square at a time. There were moments small, fleeting when beauty shone through the misery. Sunlight striking snow, making it glitter like fields of diamonds. The laughter of a child chasing shadows on the wall. The soft hum of a song that carried through the cabin, wrapping around the family like a second quilt. The settlers discovered that survival wasn't only about food or fire, it was about hope. Hope stitched into every quilt, carved into every toy, whispered into every bedtime story. Hope was the one resource they couldn't allow themselves to run out of. And so February wore on. Every day was a battle. Every night was a prayer. The settlers endured not because the cold grew kinder, but because they refused to let it break them. In the next part, we'll follow them into March, when the endless storms began to whisper of change. The days grew longer, though the cold still clung fiercely. And yet, with each pale sunrise, a subtle promise of spring began to stir. By the time March crept across the horizon, the settlers had stopped hoping the storms would end overnight. Instead, they woke each morning with a kind of quiet acceptance. Another day to endure. Another day to make it through. Hey friends, welcome back. If you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe, because what we're diving into now is the part of the hard winter where survival became less about waiting and more about stubbornly pushing forward, one breath, one fire, one meal at a time. The days were still brutally cold, but there was something different in the air. A whisper, a shift so subtle, most folks would have missed it. The sun lingered a little longer on the horizon. Shadows stretched just a little later in the day. It wasn't warmth yet, not even close, but it was a reminder that seasons turn. Even when winter tries to convince you otherwise, mornings remained a trial. Settlers rose stiff and aching, breath curling in silvery clouds inside their cabins. Windows were etched with frost, delicate as lace, and the floors groaned under frozen boards. Breakfast was still meager, thin porridge, sometimes brightened with the last dried berries, sometimes flavored with nothing at all. A strip of jerky, a hardened piece of bread, rationed with care. Children were told to chew slowly, not because food was abundant, but because stretching the moment helped the mind believe there was enough. Outside, the prairie was a sculpture in constant motion. Snowdrifts rose and collapsed like frozen waves, valleys hollowed by gusts, only to fill again hours later. Footpaths disappeared daily, forcing settlers to carve new routes to the barn or the well. Every trip outside was an act of determination. Scarves pulled tight, mittens stiff with frost, boots crunching over crusted snow. It was a silent negotiation with the season. Just let me reach the barn. Just let me make it back. The animals were no less weary. Horses stamped and shifted in their stalls, sending clouds of frosty breath into the air. Cows leaned against one another, their low moans echoing softly through the barns. Chickens tucked themselves into straw, feathers fluffed, motionless but alive. Each handful of hay or feed was weighed with heavy consequence. Warmth for the stove, or food for the creatures that would plow the fields and give milk when spring finally arrived. And yet, even as the cold pressed harder, evenings became the soul of survival. Families gathered by the fire, however faint its glow. Shadows danced across log walls, soft light flickering like tiny victories. Mothers hummed quietly while mending quilts, their voices a balm against the howling wind outside. Fathers carved toys, smoothed tools, or patched harnesses, each task a promise to the future. Children whispered stories of meadows and rivers, painting summer in words when their eyes could not see it. Do you see the pattern here? Survival wasn't about grand victories. It was about small acts of defiance against despair. A whispered song, a stitched quilt, a child's laughter breaking through the silence. These fragile threads, woven together night after night, became stronger than the fiercest storm. By mid-March, the settlers noticed more changes. Sunlight, though still pale, stretched further across the sky. Days felt longer, not in warmth, but in light. Frost still coated windows, and the air inside cabins was sharp and biting. Yet hope began to stir in quiet ways. The rhythm of survival had become second nature. Wake, stoke the fire, feed the animals, ration the food, mend, endure, repeat. And in that rhythm, there was strange strength. Of course, danger remained constant. A wrong step on ice could mean a broken bone, something few families could afford. A fire burning too fast could strip a cabin of fuel before the week was done. And the storms still came, sweeping across the prairie with relentless force, erasing footprints and burying fences. But against all odds, families leaned into each other. Their unity became their shield. At night, as the wind clawed at doors and windows, parents held their children close, listening to the steady breath of life around them. Hope was fragile, yes, but it was also stubborn. It clung to every ember, every stitch, every whispered story. The settlers didn't survive because the cold weakened. They survived because their will to endure grew stronger. By the end of March, the prairie began to change ever so slightly. Snow still blanketed the land, but sometimes, just sometimes, the air softened. Icicles dripped for an hour before freezing again. A bird's cry pierced the stillness. These were not spring yet, but promises. And to those who had lived through months of relentless frost, a promise was enough. So, as March came to a close, the settlers clung to that fragile promise. Winter wasn't over, but it was no longer endless. Every day survived brought them closer to thaw, closer to soil, closer to the life that waited beneath the snow. And in the next chapter, we'll step into April, where the prairie tested patience one final time before surrendering to spring. Because if you think the hardest part was behind them, you might be surprised. Sometimes survival is toughest when hope is just within reach. By the time April edged into the calendar, folks on the prairie were running on a strange mix of exhaustion and stubborn faith. Hey friends, welcome back. If you're just joining, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss the next part of this incredible journey. Today we're picking up where March left off, when the settlers began to sense that maybe, just maybe, winter's grip was loosening, though not without one last fight. The mornings still came cold, colder than anyone would have wanted. Frost clung stubbornly to windows and door frames, sketching delicate patterns as if winter wanted to leave its signature before retreating. Settlers pulled themselves slowly from their quilts, joints stiff, hands aching. Breakfast was still the same ritual. Porridge ladled carefully into bowls, maybe sweetened with the last few dried berries, maybe not. A thin slice of dried meat, if fortune allowed. Each bite was deliberate, each morsel measured, because nobody knew how much longer the cold would last. Outside, the prairie was a stubborn ocean of white. Snowdrifts rose like frozen dunes, valleys hollowed by winds, only to be filled again hours later. Footpaths carved the day before vanished overnight. Every trip to the barn, to the well, or to a neighbor's cabin was an expedition. Boots crunched on ice, scarves wrapped tight, eyes squinted against the sharp bite of wind. Can you imagine the patience it took just to haul a bucket of water when the world seemed determined to erase every trace of human effort? The animals endured right alongside their caretakers. Horses shifted in their stalls, stamping hooves against frozen ground. Cows pressed together, their low moans rumbling through the barn like a hymn of survival. Chickens nestled deep in straw, puffed up against the cold, motionless but alive. Every handful of hay was debated. Should it be fed to the stove to keep the cabin warm, or given to the livestock that would pull plows and provide milk in the spring? That balance was never simple, and it weighed on every family. Evenings remained the heartbeat of hope. Fires burned low but steady, casting shadows that danced across log walls. Mothers hummed soft tunes while stitching torn quilts, their voices quiet but persistent. Fathers carved toys or repaired tools, shaping not just wood, but a future. Children whispered stories of summer meadows, rivers, and sunshine, their voices weaving warmth stronger than any flame. These weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. By mid-April, hints of change slipped into daily life. Icicles began to drip in the afternoons, the sound of water tapping softly against frozen earth. The sun lingered longer, stretching shadows further into evening. Birds returned, their calls piercing the silence that winter had held hostage for so long. These were tiny signals, but to the settlers, they were enormous. Proof that spring existed, that life could return. Yet, ironically, these glimpses of hope made the waiting harder. The ground was still locked in ice, snow still pressed high against cabin walls, and storms still swept across the prairie, as if winter refused to let go without one final display of power. It was a cruel trick, the promise of warmth dangled in front of weary eyes, only to be snatched away by another blast of cold. Inside the cabins, resilience remained the only option. Quilts were mended again and again. Firewood, nearly gone, was stretched. With hay, with cornstalks, even with anything that would burn. Meals stayed simple, porridge, jerky, bread, but they were eaten together, slowly, as families leaned into each other for comfort. Laughter was rare, but when it came a child's giggle, a father's dry joke, it echoed louder than the wind outside. Do you see the lesson here? Survival wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about finding meaning in the smallest signs of life. A dripping icicle, a bird's cry, the warmth of another person's hand. These were reminders that the season of hardship wasn't forever. By the end of April, the prairie began to shift more noticeably. Snow still covered most of the land, but patches of dark earth peeked through in places where the sun struck hardest. The smell of thaw, mud, damp straw, melting ice crept into the air. Families leaned into that smell as if it were perfume, because it meant the world was changing. It meant they had outlasted something monumental. And yet the thaw brought its own dangers. Melting snow turned paths into rivers of slush. Barn roofs sagged under the weight of half-melted drifts. Wells overflowed, and livestock struggled in the wet, uneven ground. Winter had ended, yes, but it didn't leave quietly. It fought until the last, and spring's arrival came with chaos. Still, the settlers endured. They always did. And as April faded into May, they stepped into a world transformed not just by the season, but by their own perseverance. Every scar of frost, every ache of hunger, every stitch in a quilt told the same story. They had survived. And in the next part, we'll step into those first true days of spring, muddy, messy, chaotic, but alive. Because the hard winter of 1880 didn't just test endurance, it taught settlers how to rebuild when the thaw finally came. Hey guys, welcome back. If you've been following this journey, you know just how brutal the winter of 1880 was. Families had spent months rationing every crumb, burning hay to stay warm, and waking up each morning wondering if the fire would last another night. But here's the thing, surviving the cold was only half the battle. The real test came when winter finally began to loosen its grip. Spring didn't arrive with flowers and birdsong. It arrived with mud, floods, and chaos. And for many settlers, This new struggle nearly broke them. So, if you're enjoying this series, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. By late March and early April, the prairie started to groan under the weight of melting snow. Icicles that had hung like daggers from rooftops began to drip steadily, turning hard-packed paths into streams. At first, those drips were celebrated. Families stood outside just to hear the sound of water again, the steady rhythm of life returning. But within days, joy turned to worry. All that snow piled higher than fences and stacked heavy on roofs didn't just vanish. It collapsed, slid, and flooded. Cabins were suddenly surrounded by rivers of slush. Wells overflowed with dirty meltwater, making every sip a gamble. Livestock slogged through mud so deep their legs disappeared to the knees. Horses stumbled, cows sank, and chickens perched desperately on rafters to stay above the muck. Imagine spending months fighting to keep your animals alive through starvation, only to risk losing them now to drowning in mud. That was the bitter irony of spring on the prairie. And yet, the settlers couldn't pause. Every single day required action. Roofs had to be cleared before they caved under melting drifts. Trenches were dug frantically around cabins to redirect floodwater. Fences already stripped for firewood crumbled in the thaw, leaving animals vulnerable to wandering or predators. The prairie might have looked like it was softening, but for the settlers, the work only grew harder. Inside, food stores were nearly gone. Potatoes that had sprouted were planted in small patches of thawed earth, though many rotted in the wet ground. Flour was stretched with ground corn, or even sawdust, just to create bread that wouldn't hold together. Salt pork, once a staple, had been whittled down to scraps of fat that flavored soup more than they fed anyone. Hunger didn't vanish with the cold, it lingered, sharp and insistent. And then there was the mud itself. If the snow had been merciless, the mud was mocking. Boots were sucked down with every step, pulling feet out of worn shoes. Wagons sank axle deep, forcing settlers to haul them by hand. Children, eager to play after months indoors, found themselves stuck waist deep and had to be pulled out laughing at first, then crying when the cold water bit through their thin clothes. But here's where human resilience shines. Neighbors who had been separated by walls of snow for months now found ways to visit again, even if it meant slogging through mud with wet hems and soaked boots. They shared what little they had, seeds, tools, scraps of food, and swapped stories of survival. In those muddy paths, community came alive again. Because when the earth itself turned against them, settlers realized they couldn't face it alone. Evenings still centered around the fire, but now the story shifted. Instead of only remembering summers past, people began to dream out loud about summers to come. What crops would they plant? How would they repair their barns and fences? Would they finally be able to cut enough wood before the next winter? Those conversations weren't just hopeful, they were necessary. They gave shape to a future that hunger and cold had nearly stolen. And then came the first real green. At first it was only patches of grass peeking through the muck, tiny blades stubborn against the frost. Then the smell of thawing earth grew richer, heavier, almost sweet. To settlers, that smell was like a promise. After months of white silence, the land was breathing again. Chickens began to scratch at the ground for worms. Cows produced milk again, thin at first, but enough to give children strength. Even the horses perked up, stamping less from cold and more from energy. But spring didn't erase the scars of winter. Many families buried livestock lost to starvation or the floods. Some buried neighbors. Disease crept in, carried by dirty water and weakened bodies. Pneumonia, dysentery, fevers, all were as deadly as frostbite. Surviving the thaw meant surviving not just mud, but illness, exhaustion, and grief. Still, one truth defined these people. They adapted. If a cabin flooded, settlers built platforms of logs to keep bedding dry. If food ran out, they foraged early greens from the thawing prairie, wild onions, dandelions, anything edible. If boots wore through, scraps of leather were stitched, patched, and patched again. Survival wasn't glamorous, but it was ingenious. Looking back now, it's easy to see why the hard winter of 1880 became legendary. It wasn't just the snow or the cold. It was the way the season refused to let go, dragging its fight into spring and forcing ordinary people to become extraordinary just to endure. So as April slid into May, the settlers of the prairie stood on muddy ground, hungry and weary, but alive. And maybe that's the greatest victory of all, not just that they survived the cold, but that they faced every twist and turn, from burning hay for heat to battling floods in spring, with a determination that wouldn't bend. And in the next part, we'll see how these survivors finally embraced the true season of renewal, when fields, once buried in snow, began to yield crops again, and when families rebuilt from the hardest winter they had ever known. Spring on the prairie was never gentle, and in 1880 it came like a double-edged sword. Hey guys, welcome back. In our last part, we talked about how the thaw brought floods and mud so deep it swallowed boots and wagons alike. But here's the real heart of the story, how families turned from simply surviving the winter to rebuilding life in the spring. And trust me, this is where hope finally begins to bloom. If you've been enjoying this journey, give the video a thumbs up and hit subscribe. It helps us bring more history like this alive. By April, settlers were exhausted. Every log of wood, every scrap of food, every bundle of hay had been stretched to its absolute limit. Now came the question, could they coax anything from the earth before hunger claimed them? The snow had melted into heavy sheets of mud. Fences sagged or were half gone, roofs dripped with leaks, and the cellars that had once guarded precious supplies were damp, moldy, and nearly empty. Yet when the first patches of ground softened, families wasted no time. They dug, they planted, and they prayed. Seeds were a treasure. Settlers often saved kernels of corn in jars tucked high on shelves, or tied little bundles of wheat and barley in cloth to protect them from mice. Now those seeds were their lifeline. Children helped poke holes in the soggy ground, dropping in beans or corn kernels one by one, their tiny hands shaking with both cold and anticipation. Imagine planting food when your stomach already growled from hunger. That's the kind of faith these people carried. But planting wasn't simple. The fields were waterlogged, and plows stuck fast in the muck. Horses that had barely survived the winter were too weak to pull heavy loads. Some families hitched themselves to their plows, straining shoulder to wood, dragging furrows through sticky soil because giving up was not an option. Every row carved into that mud was a promise to tomorrow. Meals during this time were painfully thin. A pot of beans stretched across several days, flavored with maybe a scrap of salt pork. Wild greens, onions, dandelion leaves, Nettles were gathered by children who searched the thawing prairie like treasure hunters. Women boiled them into soups, bitter but nourishing, while the men rationed jerky so carefully that sometimes a single strip had to be shared among 5 mouths. Hunger was still a daily companion, but now it was met with work, not just waiting. And then came the rebuilding. Cabins that had groaned under the weight of snow needed repairs. Shingles were reset, logs were replaced, and mud was packed between the cracks to keep out spring winds. Barns were propped up with whatever wood remained, even broken wagon parts. Families patched clothes, threadbare from months of wear, stitching and restitching until shirts and dresses looked like quilts of survival. Yet, through it all, there was laughter again. Children ran outside in bare feet when the mud dried enough, their giggles echoing across the prairie. Neighbors who hadn't seen each other in months visited at last, carrying baskets of whatever they could spare. A little cornmeal, a few potatoes, maybe even a jug of milk. The harsh winter had broken down fences literally and figuratively, and what remained was community. Evenings around the fire changed too. Instead of only retelling memories of summers past, families began planning aloud. Which crops would grow best this season? Should they risk planting wheat early, or wait until the soil dried more? Fathers carved stakes for new fences, while mothers sketched rough plans for gardens. Children, once listless with boredom during the long freeze, now dreamed out loud of berry picking and swimming in rivers that had been locked in ice just weeks ago. And the land, almost as if it heard their determination, began to answer. Green shoots pushed stubbornly through the muck. The first real blades of grass lifted their faces to the weak Sunday. Cows fed on that grass, thin though it was, and their milk grew richer, no longer blue and watery. Chickens pecked at worms in the damp soil, clucking with energy not heard in months. Horses, ribs still showing, pricked their ears at the smell of spring. Life was coming back. Still, challenges remained. Spring floods carried disease. Wells turned brackish, forcing settlers to boil water carefully or risk sickness. Children developed coughs that lingered. Pneumonia, dysentery, and fevers were constant threats in households already weakened by months of malnutrition. And yet, there was no choice but to keep going. Planting, repairing, and preparing for the next winter was the only medicine strong enough to fight despair. One settler's diary from the time noted simply, "We lived day to day, thankful for the mud because it meant the snow was gone." That gratitude, that ability to see blessing even in mud, hunger, and exhaustion is what kept families rooted to the land. They didn't just want to survive. They wanted to build a life worth handing to their children. And so, the prairie transformed. Slowly, stubbornly, the vast white silence gave way to streaks of green. Families rose with the sun and worked until twilight, mud drying to dust on their boots. At night, they slept with tired bodies but hopeful hearts. Because after the hardest winter they had ever known, spring was not just a season, it was redemption. In the next part, we'll see how those first crops fared, how communities rebuilt stronger than before, and how the story of the hard winter of 1880 turned into a legend that echoed through generations. By the time April began to lean toward May, something remarkable was happening on the prairie. Hey guys, welcome back. Last time we talked about the mud, the floods, and the desperate planting that defined those early spring weeks. But now we turn to what came next. the miracle of life returning to a land that had nearly frozen its people out. If you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe, because what's coming is a story of resilience you don't want to miss. The first sign of hope came not from the fields, but from the sky. Geese returned in ragged V-shaped lines, honking loudly as they cut across the clouds. To settlers who had spent months hearing nothing but wind and silence, those cries sounded like music. Soon after, robins appeared, hopping across thawed patches of ground, pecking at worms churned up by the floods. Even the simplest chirp of a bird reminded families that the cycle of seasons was moving forward, whether they felt ready or not. On the ground, the change was slower but steady. Those seeds planted in desperation, corn kernels, beans, barley, began to push through the soil. Tiny green shoots that could so easily have been overlooked became symbols of survival. Children ran to the fields each morning, pointing with excitement at every new sprout. Parents tried to temper their joy with caution, knowing late frosts could still come, but even they couldn't help but smile. With the thaw came new work. Fence rails that had been burned for firewood had to be replaced. Wagons ruined by snow needed new wheels. Roofs sagging under melted drifts had to be repaired before spring rains arrived. Settlers bartered with neighbors eggs for nails, a strip of leather for seed potatoes. No one had much, but everyone had something to trade. This barter system wasn't just about survival, it was about connection. The same neighbors who once lived miles apart in isolation were now bound together by the hardships they had endured. Food was still scarce, but foraging helped. Women and children gathered wild greens, fiddlehead ferns, and dandelion leaves. Boys set snares for rabbits, their hands trembling from hunger but steady from determination. Men tried their luck fishing in streams swollen with snowmelt. Sometimes they came home empty-handed, but sometimes a family feasted on fresh trout roasted over a fire, the taste almost forgotten after months of dry beans and salted meat. Livestock too began to recover. Cows grazing on new grass produced richer milk. Chickens pecked freely at insects, their clucks lively once more. Horses regained some strength, their coats shedding the dull look of winter for a glossy shine. Families who had debated slaughtering their animals in January now thanked their restraint, for those creatures were key to rebuilding life. Evenings in this season carried a different mood than the despair of winter. Fires still crackled, but the conversations shifted. Fathers talked of how many acres they could plant. Mothers discussed how to stretch milk into butter again. Children sang songs learned from grandparents, voices echoing into the prairie night. And always, there was gratitude, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes kept quietly in the heart, that they had made it this far. Still, not everything was easy. Late frosts came, sometimes overnight, burning the tips of tender shoots. Families scrambled to cover rows with blankets or straw, but losses were inevitable. Storms rolled in with thunder that shook the cabins, bringing hail that flattened young crops. And of course, hunger remained. Just because the ground was green didn't mean the cellars were full. Meals were still rationed, and every bowl of stew or loaf of bread was stretched to its limit. Yet there was a shift in spirit. Winter had been about endurance. Spring was about possibility. Where once settlers counted how many logs were left for the fire, now they counted rows of corn. Where once they feared the silence of snow, now they listened for the hum of bees. The prairie was no longer an enemy, it was an ally, slowly offering back what it had withheld. One story often retold among descendants speaks of a young girl who kept a diary through the winter. Her final winter entry read simply, "We burn hay. I am cold." But her first spring entry said, "I saw a flower today." That single line captures the whole transformation, the shift from survival to hope, from darkness to light. By May's end, the land looked different. Green stretched across fields that had been barren. Rivers, though swollen, carried fish. Gardens promised onions, beans, and squash. Families, though still lean from hunger, carried themselves taller. They had faced the coldest winter of their lives and now stood on the edge of renewal. And yet, the settlers knew hardship was never far away. Grasshoppers, storms, and new winters were always possibilities. But for now, they chose to breathe deeply of the spring air, to feel the warmth of the sun on their faces, and to dream again. Because sometimes survival isn't just about enduring the worst, it's about learning to see beauty in the smallest beginnings. When summer finally arrived on the prairie of 1880, it didn't sweep in with the soft ease we imagine today. Hey guys, welcome back. Last time we walked through those early green shoots of spring, when every blade of grass felt like a miracle. But now, as June settled in, the settlers found themselves facing a new chapter, one filled not with snow, but with heat, storms, and challenges of a different kind. If you've been following along, hit that like button and subscribe, because this next part of the journey is just as gripping as the winter itself. The prairie in summer was a place of extremes. After months of white silence, the land exploded with color. Grasses rose high, flowers painted the meadows with yellows and purples, and the sky stretched in a dome of endless blue. For families who had nearly lost hope during winter, the sight of green fields was like water to the thirsty. But beauty came with burdens. The very same sun that thawed the earth now threatened to scorch it. Fields planted in April and May demanded constant care. Corn needed weeding, beans needed tending, barley had to be watched for pests. The work was endless. Fathers and sons sweated under the hot sun, bent over rows for hours, hands calloused, backs sore. Mothers and daughters carried water from streams to gardens, pails heavy and shoulders aching. Everyone, no matter their age, had a role. Even the youngest children picked weeds, shooed chickens from the vegetable beds, or hauled small sticks for kindling. Food was still rationed, though the variety had improved. Wild berries ripened along fence lines, sweet and tart, a welcome change from the salty meats of winter. Gardens yielded onions and lettuce, and milk from cows was richer now that the animals grazed on fresh pasture. Butter churns clacked steadily in cabins, and the smell of fresh bread occasionally replaced the weary scent of porridge. Still, every meal was eaten with an eye on the future. Could they stretch their supplies until harvest? The livestock that had barely survived the winter now became essential again. Horses were needed to plow new rows or haul loads. Cows gave milk that children depended on. Chickens laid eggs more steadily, their feathers glossy under the summer Sunday. The settlers treated these animals with a mix of gratitude and worry, knowing that one illness or one predator could undo months of effort. And predators were not the only threat. Grasshoppers, those infamous destroyers of the prairie, began to appear. At first, just a few, clicking and leaping in the fields. But every settler knew the danger. They told stories of swarms so thick they blackened the sky, devouring crops in hours, leaving behind stripped stalks and ruined dreams. Families prayed the insects would move on, while children ran through fields clapping and chasing them, unaware of the fear they inspired in adults. Storms brought another trial. The prairie sky could turn from blue to black in minutes, winds roaring across the land with a fury that rivaled winter blizzards. Lightning cracked so close it rattled the windows, followed by rain that pounded the earth. Sometimes hail fell, smashing tender crops into the soil. Cabins shook, roofs leaked, and animals panicked in barns. Settlers could do nothing but wait it out, huddled together, hoping the storm would pass without disaster. Yet despite these dangers, there were joys. Summer evenings glowed golden, the air filled with the scent of clover and the sound of crickets. Families gathered outside cabins, sitting on rough-hewn benches or grassy patches, watching the sun sink into the horizon. Children played barefoot in the fields, laughing as fireflies lit up around them. Fathers strummed fiddles, mothers hummed old songs, and neighbors sometimes gathered for barn dances that lifted spirits as much as they tired bodies. But the weight of memory never left. Every bowl of stew, every loaf of bread, every laugh at a summer dance carried a shadow, the reminder of what winter had taken and what could return. Families told their children, "Remember this. Remember how hard it was. Be ready when it comes again." It was not said with fear, but with determination. By July, crops began to fill out. Corn stalks stretched high, beans twined around poles, barley bent heavy with grain. The fields looked like redemption itself. Still, families didn't count their blessings too early. They knew frost could still come late, or pests could sweep in overnight. They knew hunger could return with the next season. And so, they worked tirelessly, storing every extra egg, drying berries, salting meat, and preparing root cellars for whatever lay ahead. One diary from a settler's wife recorded that summer with a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion. "The land is green and good," she wrote, "but the work is endless. We rise with the sun, we sleep long after dark, and still there is more to be done. Yet every row of corn, every jar of berries, every pat of butter is a victory. We survived the winter, we will survive again." The prairie in summer was not an easy paradise. It was a teacher. It gave generously, but only to those who respected its power. Settlers learned to read the skies, to smell the wind, to watch the insects and the animals for signs of change. Nature was both partner and adversary, and survival meant honoring both sides. And so, the hard winter of 1880 was giving way to a fragile summer of promise. Children who had gone to bed hungry in January now fell asleep with berry juice on their lips. Parents who had whispered in fear by firelight now whispered prayers of thanks. And across the endless fields, the wind carried a new sound, not the howl of snow, but the rustle of corn, the buzz of bees, and the quiet song of survival. Last time we walked together through the blazing heat of summer on the prairie, when green fields and long days replaced the white silence of winter. But now, the story shifts again. The air is changing, the days are shorter, and the first whispers of autumn rustle through the corn. If you've been enjoying this journey, give this video a like and make sure you're subscribed, because the next chapter is one of both triumph and quiet dread. By September of 1880, the prairie looked nothing like it had 6 months before. Where there had been endless drifts of snow, there now stood fields heavy with grain. Corn stalks towered over children, beans wound thick around poles, pumpkins swelled orange in the dirt. For settlers who had nearly starved in January, it was a sight that filled them with relief, so deep it almost felt like disbelief. But relief never lasted long out here. Everyone knew that harvest time wasn't just about gathering food. It was a race against the clock. The first frosts could come early, sweeping across the prairie with little warning, turning tender plants black overnight. So families worked furiously. From dawn until long after dusk, they cut, bundled, hauled, and stored. The sounds of autumn were not soft. The thunk of axes splitting firewood, the scrape of sickles cutting wheat, the creak of wagons overloaded with corn and squash. Sweat mixed with dust, and hands blistered from the endless labor. Yet no one complained, because every jar sealed, every root buried, every kernel dried, was a promise that the next winter would not be as cruel. Inside cabins, women boiled and preserved vegetables, stirring steaming kettles and filling rows of glass jars that glistened like jewels in the firelight. Apples were sliced and dried on racks. Pumpkins were roasted, mashed, and stored. The sharp scent of vinegar filled the air as cucumbers and onions were pickled. For children, the sight of shelves filling up was more comforting than any bedtime story. It meant survival. And then there was the butchering. As the weather cooled, families chose which animals to slaughter before winter. It was a grim necessity. Chickens, hogs, sometimes even a cow. It was never easy, but it was survival. Smokehouses filled the air with the smell of curing meat, thick and savory, a scent that mingled with the crispness of autumn leaves. It was a season of taking, but it was also a season of gratitude. Settlers knew that every cut of meat, every strip of jerky, every cured ham meant one less night of hunger. But even in the richness of harvest, fear crept in. Old scars from the previous winter ran deep. Families asked one another, would this be enough? Could their stores last if the cold came early? Would the storms return as fierce? As before, parents didn't voice all their worries to their children, but the fear was there, unspoken, heavy as the prairie sky. Neighbors gathered often, sharing both work and comfort. Harvest suppers became brief moments of joy in a season of toil. Long wooden tables groaned under plates of cornbread, roasted squash, beans, and pies made with whatever fruit could be spared. Neighbors laughed, fiddles played, and for a night the prairie felt alive with community. But beneath the laughter was urgency. Everyone knew the work wasn't done. Winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. The land itself gave warnings. Leaves turned brittle and red along fence lines. The winds shifted, carrying a sharper bite. Birds gathered in restless flocks, darkening the sky as they flew south. Horses grew thick coats, cows pressed closer together at night, and every dawn carried frost that lingered longer on the grass. Nature was speaking, and the settlers listened. For children, autumn had its own magic. They ran through cornfields, climbed haystacks, and played hide-and-seek among pumpkins and barrels. They didn't yet carry the full weight of survival, but even they noticed when their parents' voices grew hushed, when conversations turned to weather, when fathers scanned the horizon with worry instead of wonder. Childhood on the prairie was short, and autumn reminded everyone why. By October, cabins smelled of firewood and smoke. Chopped logs were stacked high against walls. Hay was stored in barns, and root cellars brimmed with potatoes, carrots, beets, and jars of preserved food. Every family counted, recounted, and tallied what they had. Still, the question lingered. Was it enough? History had taught them harshly, nature always took more than expected. And then, sometimes, the unexpected happened. A storm would arrive early, dropping snow before the harvest was finished. Crops would rot in the fields. Families who thought they had enough suddenly realized they did not. That was the shadow that haunted every meal, every dance, every prayer of thanks. Autumn was both feast and fear, abundance and anxiety, but it was also a season of resilience. Settlers told stories by firelight, not just to pass the time, but to pass down courage. They reminded one another of the ancestors who had crossed oceans, who had broken the soil with bare hands, who had endured famine, sickness, and storms. Survival was not just about food, it was about spirit. And as much as the prairie tested their bodies, it also tested their resolve. So as the last leaves fell and frost thickened on every window, the families of 1880 faced forward. Their pantries were fuller than before, their barns stocked, their hearts both hopeful and afraid. They had survived one of the hardest winters in memory. Now they would see if they had learned enough to survive the next. The prairie has a way of reminding people just how small they are. One day, you're stacking firewood under a pale October sun, and the next, the sky turns heavy and gray, as if it's lowering itself to press down on the land. That was how November of 1880 arrived, not gently, not with whispers, but with a sudden shift that settlers felt in their bones before the first snowflake even touched the ground. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've been following along, you know our settlers had just finished their harvest, filling cellars and smokehouses with the fruits of their labor. But here's the twist. Nature wasn't about to give them time to rest. If you're enjoying this journey, give this video a like and make sure you're subscribed, because the next part of their story is where the prairie shows its true, merciless hand. The first snow came earlier than anyone wanted. Families woke one morning to find the world outside already coated in white. It wasn't a gentle dusting. It was thick, heavy, clinging snow that bent fence posts and muffled the sound of wagons. Horses shifted uneasily, their breaths turning into quick clouds. Cows pressed together, confused by the sudden change, while chickens refused to leave their straw nests. At first, some settlers laughed it off. "It'll melt in a day or two," they said, brushing snow off their coats. But deep down, everyone remembered the winter before. One snow was never just one snow. It was a signal, a warning, and sure enough, the days stayed cold. The snow didn't melt, it crusted harder each night, and every morning the sun rose weaker, as though it too had grown weary. The work shifted instantly. No longer was it about harvesting or preserving, it was about bracing. Men hauled extra firewood into cabins, stacking it so high against walls that it nearly blocked the windows. Women boiled down the last of the autumn vegetables, making soups that could be stretched for days. Children were given tasks too, gathering kindling, feeding scraps to animals, patching cracks in walls with mud and straw. On the prairie, every pair of hands mattered, no matter how small. And then came the first storm. It rolled in fast, carried on a wind so sharp it seemed to slice through wool and leather alike. By dusk, the horizon disappeared. Snow fell sideways, driven by gusts that rattled shutters and howled through cracks in cabins. Families huddled inside, listening to the roof groan under the weight of snow, praying it would hold. Fires burned hotter, hay stuffed into stoves when wood burned too quickly, filling the air with a sweet, choking smoke. Imagine sitting in that cabin. The walls creak, the fire spits and hisses, and outside it's just white chaos. You don't know how long the storm will last, or whether the barn will still be standing when it's over. You count the jars on the shelf. You glance at the woodpile, and you wonder not for the first time if it's enough. When the storm finally broke, the prairie was unrecognizable. Drifts climbed higher than fence posts. Paths vanished. Wagons were buried to their wheels. The land that had been wide open in autumn now felt like a maze of white walls. Settlers strapped makeshift snowshoes to their boots, breaking trails to barns and neighbors' homes. Every step sinking deep, every breath a puff of frost. Animals had suffered too. Some cows refused to rise, their bodies stiff from the cold. Horses stood trembling, hooves frozen to the barn floor. Chickens had to be dug out from under blankets of snow that seeped in through cracks. Every creature was part of the settlers' survival, and every loss was felt like a blow to the family itself. And still, life went on. Families adjusted. Children learned to melt snow for water when wells froze. Women patched mittens with scraps of cloth, turning them inside out when one side wore thin. Men cut blocks of frozen hay, burning them slowly, watching the flames sputter but cling just enough to keep the cabin warm. It wasn't comfort, it was survival. Evenings, though, still carried their fragile rituals. Families gathered by the fire, tired but together. Shadows flickered across log walls as mothers hummed, fathers whittled, and children whispered stories of spring meadows and running streams. Those stories weren't just entertainment, they were lifelines. In the roar of winter's first storms, imagination was a form of resistance. By the end of November, settlers understood this wasn't going to be a mild season. Winter had arrived early, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. The shelves looked smaller, the woodpile shorter, and the nights longer. Still, they pressed on. Because on the prairie, there was no other choice. You endured or you didn't. And for these families, giving up was never an option. December should have carried warmth, at least in spirit. Back east, families were already stringing pine branches above mantles. Children, counting the days until Christmas, stockings were filled. But out on the Dakota prairie in 1880, December did not arrive with bells or cheer. It came with a roar, the kind of roar that rattled cabins, smothered hope, and forced families to measure not just their food, but their very strength. Hey guys, welcome back. By now, our settlers had endured November's early storms. They had patched walls, burned hay for heat, and scraped together every ounce of endurance they had. But December brought something worse. Storms that didn't just strike and pass, but lingered, stacking one on top of the other until days blurred into a single white eternity. If you're finding this story gripping, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because things are about to get even harsher. The first week of December began deceptively calm. The prairie lay still, snow crusted hard under a pale sun, the horizon shimmering like glass. Settlers ventured out, hauling water, checking on neighbors, even daring to believe the worst might be behind them. Children made small games of sliding across frozen patches, laughter briefly breaking winter's silence. But on the sixth day, the sky darkened, winds picked up, and the sound returned the howl, low at first, then building until it drowned everything else. Snow came in waves. It wasn't just flakes, it was sheets, walls, whole rivers of snow driven sideways by winds strong enough to tear shingles off roofs. Families huddled inside their cabins, stuffing rags into cracks, piling snow against doors to block drafts. The storm howled for 2 days straight. When it finally lifted, the prairie was a labyrinth of drifts taller than men, fences swallowed whole, barns nearly invisible beneath white mounds. For settlers, chores didn't stop just because the land was buried. Cows still needed feeding, horses needed water, chickens had to be checked. Parents bundled themselves in every scrap of clothing, tied scarves around their faces, and staggered out into the storm's aftermath. Imagine opening your cabin door and finding nothing but a wall of snow where your path used to be. Every step forward meant carving through ice, boots sinking deep, lungs burning with each frosty breath. Inside, supplies dwindled. Flour sacks shrank. Potatoes softened in the root cellars. Dried meat grew scarce. Women stretched meals with ingenuity broths made from scraps, bread thinned with cornmeal, porridge flavored with the last of the berries. Children learned not to ask for seconds. Every bite had a weight. Every spoonful was measured not just for the day, but for the months still to come. And then came the second storm, stronger than the first. It struck before families had finished digging out from the last one. Snow hammered roofs, winds howled through shutters, and temperatures plunged so low that water froze solid inside buckets near the fire. Livestock cried out in barns, their breath forming icy clouds that lingered in the dark. Settlers faced brutal choices: burn precious hay for heat and risk starving the animals, or watch their children shiver as the fire died down. Some split the difference, burning just enough hay to keep the stove alive, feeding animals only a fraction of what they needed, praying both would last. Evenings turned into fragile sanctuaries. Families sat shoulder to shoulder, the glow of the fire barely reaching the corners of their cabins. Mothers sewed by dim light, fingers numb, humming to keep spirits steady. Fathers carved toys, not because they had time to spare, but because children needed something, anything to remind them the world held more than snow and silence. Stories of warmer days filled the air. Children imagined fields of green, rivers of running water, the sweet taste of fresh berries. These visions weren't just dreams, they were survival. Christmas drew closer, but there were no candles in windows, no decorated trees, no feasts. Gifts, if they existed, were carved from wood or sewn from scraps. A doll made from leftover cloth. A whistle carved from pine. For many children, the only gift was a story told by the fire or a rare piece of sugar saved from summer. And yet, those small tokens meant more than gold. They reminded families that even in the harshest winters, humanity endured. The storms kept coming. A blizzard in mid-December buried cabins so deep that families had to dig tunnels just to reach their barns. For days, no one saw the horizon. The prairie was gone, swallowed by white. Settlers marked their paths with ropes tied from door to barn, guiding them back when the wind erased everything within seconds. It was survival at its most primitive. And still, they endured. Each day survived was a victory. Each fire that burned through the night was a triumph. And each morning, no matter how cold, families rose again. By the end of December, no one asked when winter would end. They simply asked themselves how to last one more day, one more night. That was the rhythm. That was life. January did not simply arrive on the prairie. It descended. It pressed itself into every gap of wood, every seam of clothing, every fragile bone of the settlers who had already endured 2 punishing months of storms. Hey guys, welcome back. If December had tested the will of every man, woman, and child, then January would push them past the edge of what most of us today could imagine. If you're finding these stories powerful, don't forget to tap like and subscribe. It really helps keep these forgotten chapters alive. The new year began with a silence so sharp it felt wrong. The air was still, the sky gray, the prairie frozen into glass. For a few hours, families dared to believe the storms might ease. They stepped outside, boots crunching, eyes scanning an endless horizon. But by the second day, the wind returned, and this time, it didn't let go. Snow came thick and fast, piling into ridges taller than wagons. Winds howled like freight trains, driving ice into faces until skin cracked and bled. Cabins groaned under the weight, roofs sagging with drifts that never stopped building. People moved snow from doors just to keep them opening, only to find them blocked again within hours. It was as if nature itself was determined to erase human presence from the prairie. Food grew even scarcer. Root cellars, once stocked with potatoes and carrots, were nearly bare. Families boiled thin soups, stretched flour into flatbread that barely held together, and rationed jerky as if it were gold. Hunger gnawed quietly, not with dramatic cries, but with the dull ache of stomachs that never felt full. Parents pretended to eat so children could finish their bowls. Mothers broke bread in half, slipping the larger piece to little hands, while keeping only a corner for themselves. But the hardest blow was firewood, or rather, the lack of it. By January, most settlers had burned through their logs. Some tore apart barns, sheds, even fences to keep flames alive. Others turned to hay, twisting it tight and feeding it into stoves. Hay burned fast, hot, and dirty. It left behind smoke that stung eyes and throats, and a bitter smell that clung to every blanket. But it was heat, and in January, heat meant life. Imagine sitting by a fire, fueled by the very food meant for your cattle, hearing cows lowing in the barn, knowing every handful burned meant less for them, less chance they would see spring. These were not choices anyone wanted to make. They were choices forced by a winter that seemed determined to break them. Livestock suffered. Horses stamped in their stalls, ribs beginning to show through winter coats. Cows huddled together, their breaths thick clouds in the frozen air, their moans echoing against barn walls. Chickens went silent, conserving what little energy they had, their feathers fluffed in desperate defense against the cold. Some animals didn't make it through the month. Families mourned each loss, not just for the life gone, but for the future. It represented a spring without milk, without eggs, without strong horses to plow. And yet, every evening, families gathered by their fires. They hummed songs, told stories, and clung to each other. Fathers spoke of summers past, of fields full of wheat, of rivers shimmering in the Sunday. Mothers reminded children that winter was not forever, that one day they would hear birds again, smell grass again, feel warmth on their faces. Children whispered dreams of running barefoot through green meadows, of berries sweet on the tongue, of water that flowed instead of froze. The storms of January were relentless. Days blurred into nights, nights into days. Outside, the world was erased by white. Inside, families survived hour by hour, flame by flame. And still, somehow, they endured. Because when all else failed, they had each other. By the end of January 1881, no one asked when spring would come. They only asked, "Can we last until tomorrow? And tomorrow after that?" Survival was no longer about hope for better days, but about the stubborn refusal to give up in the face of a winter that seemed endless. February did not arrive with mercy. It settled over the prairie like an iron hand, heavy and cold, squeezing every ounce of strength from families who had already endured 3 endless months of winter. The storms rolled in again and again, sometimes lasting for days. Snow swallowed fences, drifted over rooftops, and filled every gap where wind could howl. Settlers woke to doors sealed shut, forcing them to dig their way out before tending animals or fetching water. Every task, hauling buckets, splitting kindling, carrying hay, felt slower, harder, heavier. The cold was no longer just outside. It lived inside their bones. But in February, it wasn't only the cold that threatened them. Sickness arrived. The dampness of cabins, the smoke from burning hay, the lack of proper food, all of it weakened bodies already running on empty. Children coughed at night, their small chests rattling. Mothers worried over fevers that lingered, dabbing foreheads with cloths dipped in melted snow. Fathers, who worked themselves past exhaustion to keep fires going and animals fed, often fell ill too, their strength drained when it was needed most. Imagine trying to fight illness without medicine, without rest, without warmth. A sore throat became dangerous. A simple fever carried real fear. Families leaned on remedies passed down through memory teas, brewed from dried herbs, poultices made from whatever roots remained in storage. They whispered prayers over the sick, their voices soft in the dim light of the fire, hoping faith could do what food and medicine could not. And yet, February also revealed something powerful: the strength of community. Neighbors checked on each other when storms broke. Men trudged miles across snowdrifts to bring a handful of firewood to a widow's cabin. Women carried loaves of bread, small as they were, to families with too many mouths to feed. Children shared what little they had, slipping a piece of jerky or a toy carved from scrap wood into the hands of a friend. These acts did not erase the hardship, but they reminded settlers that they were not alone. And sometimes, that reminder made the difference between despair and endurance. Livestock, too, hung on by the thinnest thread. Horses grew gaunt, their coats dull. Cows produced less milk, their bodies conserving what little strength they had left. Chickens stopped laying eggs entirely. Families faced impossible choices, whether to slaughter an animal for meat now or keep it alive in hopes it would see spring and provide more in the future. Every decision carried consequences, and none were easy. Evenings in February were quiet, but not silent. Families gathered near the fire, quilts pulled close, shadows flickering across log walls. Mothers mended worn clothing, sewing patches over patches. Fathers sharpened tools, carving handles from scraps. Children whispered stories, their imaginations painting pictures of warmth and light in a world of snow. And always, someone coughed, a reminder that illness sat among them like an uninvited guest. Yet even in the harshest weeks, resilience showed itself in small ways. A child's laughter breaking through a fit of coughs, a neighbor arriving with a lantern and a smile, carrying a sack of cornmeal, a father carving a small bird from wood, handing it to his daughter as a promise that spring would bring real ones back to the sky. By the end of February, the settlers had learned a truth most of us will never face. Survival was not just about food or fire. It was about leaning on each other, about giving even when you had almost nothing left to give. It was about finding warmth, not only in the flames of hay-fed stoves, but in the simple, stubborn kindness of people who refused to let one another face the winter alone. March arrived without fanfare. There was no sudden thaw, no gentle breeze hinting at warmth. The prairie was still white, endless, and unyielding. Snowdrifts reached the windowsills of cabins, and fences disappeared beneath frozen waves. Yet, even in this merciless season, something subtle had shifted. The light lingered just a little longer each evening. The sun, though pale, stretched across the horizon in a way that felt different. Shadows lengthened, and when the wind quieted for a rare hour, families dared to believe that winter might not last forever. Life, however, remained brutally hard. Fires still consumed hay as often as wood. The cabin smelled of smoke and scorched grass, a sweetness that clung to every quilt and coat. Families rationed the last jars of vegetables, the final handfuls of flour, and the thin strips of jerky saved for emergencies. Meals were small, eaten slowly, as if stretching out the flavor could somehow stretch out survival itself. The animals showed the strain even more than the people. Horses grew restless, stamping their hooves in icy stalls. Their once strong bodies were lean, ribs visible under thick coats. Cows produced barely enough milk to keep calves alive. Chickens huddled in straw, silent and sluggish, no longer laying eggs. Every choice about feed was agonizing. Keep them alive for spring, or slaughter one now to feed the family. By now, settlers had fallen into a rhythm of endurance. Each morning began with the same slow process, rubbing life back into numb fingers, breaking ice from water buckets, coaxing flames from stubborn embers. Children bundled into layers before stepping outside, their scarves stiff with frost before they even reached the barn. Every task required patience, every movement deliberate, for mistakes in this season could cost dearly. But amid all the hardship, there were flickers of hope. A bird spotted on the horizon, its wings cutting across the pale sky. A patch of ground near the cabin wall, where the snow melted faster, revealing brown earth beneath. A day when the sun's warmth could actually be felt on the face, if only for a moment. Settlers noticed these things. They clung to them, because when you've spent months in a world of white silence, even the smallest sign of change feels like a promise. Evenings in March carried a different kind of quiet. Families still gathered around the fire, but conversations began to shift. Mothers talked of planting once the ground thawed. Fathers spoke of repairing fences and breaking soil. Children whispered dreams of running barefoot through grass again. The fire still offered warmth, but it also became a place to imagine, to plan, to believe that life beyond the snow was waiting. Still, the wind reminded them not to grow too eager. Storms swept across the prairie, erasing paths in minutes, howling against cabins as if to prove that winter would not yield easily. Shutters rattled, doors shook, and inside, families pressed closer together, hearts steady, waiting for the storm to pass. Yet even in these nights, resilience glowed. A mother's lullaby, soft and steady, carrying comfort through the roar of the wind. A father sharpening tools, preparing for work that had not yet come but surely would. A child laughing at a carved toy, proof that joy could exist even when everything outside said otherwise. By late March, settlers understood something profound. Survival was no longer about fighting winter, it was about outlasting it, about enduring long enough for the sun to return, the earth to soften, and the prairie to breathe again. They had burned hay when wood was gone, stretched meals, thinner than anyone thought possible, and leaned on each other when strength failed. They were tired, thinner, quieter, but they were still there. And in a season that had taken so much, that fact alone was victory. By the final days of March, settlers felt caught between two worlds. The prairie still wore its cloak of white, endless and cold, yet the light had shifted. Days stretched longer, evenings lingered, and when the clouds broke, the sun spilled across the snow in shimmering brilliance. It was a cruel beauty, stunning to the eye, but carrying almost no warmth. Inside the cabins, families were thinner now, their cheeks hollow, their eyes heavy from months of restless sleep. Every quilt smelled of smoke and hay, every garment patched and repatched. The stoves burned with whatever fuel could be found, scraps of wood, twisted bundles of straw, even bits of broken furniture that once had been part of their lives. Survival had turned possessions into kindling. Meals were no longer about taste, only about getting through. Thin porridge with the faintest sweetness of dried berries. Strips of jerky stretched so far that each slice seemed almost translucent. Children chewed slowly, savoring what little flavor remained, while parents silently portioned their own bowls smaller, saving the best for their young. And yet, outside the barn, change whispered. A patch of earth appeared near fence posts, where the snow melted faster, revealing the black soil beneath. The sound of water trickling from an overhang small, but enough to remind them that ice could not last forever. A bird's call carried across the silent prairie, startling in its clarity. Spring was not here, but it was coming. The animals endured with the same fragile stubbornness. Horses stamped at the frozen ground, their breath hanging in clouds. Cows leaned shoulder to shoulder, thin but alive, while chickens remained huddled in straw, feathers puffed like armor. Every handful of hay still carried the weight of a decision: burn it for warmth tonight, or keep it for the livestock tomorrow. Families knew they were gambling on the future with every choice. Evenings remained the anchor of life. Shadows danced on log walls as flames flickered, and around the fire, families clung to rituals that had carried them this far. Mothers sewed and mended by dim light, their needles threading hope into every stitch. Fathers carved toys or repaired tools, shaping wood into promises of a tomorrow where work would replace waiting. Children whispered stories of running through tall grass, splashing in creeks, and chasing sunlight. These moments were fragile, but they kept hearts from hardening against the cold. The wind, however, refused to release its hold. Storms still swept across the plains, blinding, howling, stripping away any sense of direction. Doors rattled, shutters banged, and inside, families braced themselves, pressing close, waiting for the storm to move on. Hope was fragile, but winter still had teeth. By early April, settlers knew they had done something remarkable. They had endured the hardest stretch, the long weeks when snow buried the world, and food was nearly gone. They had bent, but not broken. And in that stubborn endurance, there was a kind of quiet triumph. By the first week of April, something remarkable stirred on the prairie. It wasn't warmth exactly, but the air felt different. The bitter sting that once cut through layers of wool had softened, just slightly, like winter was losing its grip. Settlers noticed it first in the mornings. Frost still clung to windows, but the sun lingered longer, and its pale glow reached further into the cabin, painting the walls in silver instead of gray. Breakfast remained thin porridge flavored with the last handfuls of dried berries, strips of jerky shared sparingly, but for the first time in months, families ate with a faint sense of relief. They knew they had crossed the worst stretch. Survival had become routine, and every bite, however meager, carried them closer to spring. Outdoors, the prairie was shifting. Snowdrifts, once towering higher than fences, had begun to shrink. Where the wind once sculpted endless white ridges, dark soil now peeked through in patches, soggy and rich, waiting for new life. Water trickled from rooftops, pooling in icy puddles that glimmered in the weak sunlight. The sound of dripping was strange, almost unsettling, after so many months of silence. For settlers, the thaw brought both hope and danger. Paths turned to mud, boots sank deep, and every step from cabin to barn meant dragging feet heavy with ice and muck. Wells filled with meltwater, some of it dirty and unsafe, forcing families to boil what little they could before drinking. Yet even with these challenges, the change felt like a promise. Animals sensed it too. Horses shifted with more energy, stomping less from cold and more from restlessness. Cows, though still thin, stirred with a hint of life in their eyes, sniffing the damp air as if they could smell grass hidden beneath the snow. Chickens fluttered from their corners, shaking out feathers stiff from months of huddling. Evenings were still precious. Families gathered around the fire, though the flames burned smaller now, each log or bundle of hay carefully chosen, not because there was plenty, but because the cold no longer threatened to take their lives in a single night. Shadows still danced across the walls, and mothers still hummed while sewing. Fathers carved, children whispered stories, but the mood had shifted. The words spoken were not just of endurance, but of possibility. What would they plant first when the earth finally softened? Corn? Beans? Would the cows calve strong enough to grow into the next season? Would the chickens lay again once the days grew long? These questions weren't just practical. They were prayers disguised as plans. Yet winter was not finished. The wind still came hard across the plains, carrying bursts of snow that reminded everyone of nature's unpredictability. Settlers didn't celebrate loudly. They knew better. But in quiet glances, in the way a mother's hand lingered on her child's cheek, or the way fathers let their tools rest just a little longer by the fire, there was recognition. They had survived something nearly impossible. And though April nights still froze, though the barns still echoed with thin animal cries, though the fire still needed feeding, There was a subtle, undeniable truth: spring was coming. By mid-April, the prairie no longer looked like an endless sea of white. The snow had pulled back in uneven patches, revealing soggy ground dark as ink. Footpaths that once crunched with ice now sucked at boots with heavy mud. Cabins that had groaned beneath drifts were finally visible again, though their roofs sagged with the weight of water that seeped into every seam. The settlers had waited for this moment all winter, but with thaw came new dangers. Where snow had once offered a kind of grim predictability, mud meant chaos. Wagons sank to their axles, fences leaned under the shifting ground, and every walk to the barn became a battle against muck that clung to leather and froze solid again overnight. Animals fared no better. Horses, eager to move after months of confinement, slipped on wet boards slick with thaw. Cows sank into soft patches of earth, their ribs showing beneath thinning hides as they searched instinctively for grass not yet grown. Chickens, emboldened by light, picked at mud and straw, restless but still too weak to range far. Each creature mirrored the settlers themselves, restless, weary, alive, but not yet free. Inside the cabins, routines remained cautious. Fires burned smaller but were still essential. The smell of damp wood filled the rooms, different from the dry crackle of hay that had warmed them through the coldest nights. Breakfasts had not grown richer. Porridge was still stretched thin, dried meat rationed into strips, so small they could vanish in 2 bites. But now, there was conversation around the table. Plans, arguments, even about what crops to plant first, how to mend broken tools, which neighbors might have spare seed to trade. Evenings, once defined by quiet endurance, began to shift. Fathers no longer carved toys only for distraction. They shaped handles for plows, stakes for gardens. Mothers still sewed, but now with an eye toward the future, mending sacks that would carry seed, patching aprons for spring chores. Children whispered their same stories, but their voices carried a new note: excitement, anticipation. And yet, just when hope seemed close enough to touch, April reminded them of its cruelty. Storms swept across the plains, sudden and fierce. Winds howled with the same voice they had in January, carrying sheets of sleet that froze the thawing earth into jagged crusts. Settlers watched helplessly as animals shivered once more, as barns rattled, as half-frozen mud turned back to ice beneath their boots. It was a false spring, and they knew it. Still, they pressed on. For every storm that drove them back inside, there was a morning when the air smelled faintly of earth instead of snow. For every night that demanded quilts and embers, there was a day when the sun lingered just a little longer on the horizon, painting the prairie in pale gold. Hope was fragile, but it was growing. And for settlers who had endured the merciless winter of 1880, that was enough. By the final weeks of April, winter's grip was broken, but it did not release the land gently. The snow that had blanketed the prairie for months melted in torrents, rushing toward every low place, filling creeks and rivers that had lain silent under ice. What began as trickles became streams, and streams quickly swelled into waters that roared with unstoppable force. Cabins that had endured the weight of snow now faced an enemy just as relentless: flood. Settlers watched as fields they had prayed to plant were swallowed beneath rushing water. Barnyards turned to swamps. Wells, once carefully dug for fresh drinking water, filled with mud and runoff. The rivers, once frozen highways, broke their chains of ice with terrifying noise. Massive sheets cracked and split apart, carried downstream like jagged blades. The sound echoed for miles, as if the land itself was breaking open. Children pressed to windows, both awed and afraid, while parents exchanged grim glances. Floods could undo everything survival had purchased. Inside the cabins, life shifted once again. Fires burned less fiercely now, but dampness crept into every corner. The smell of wet wood replaced the sharp scent of smoke. Clothes never fully dried. Quilts carried the weight of moisture. Floors sagged, and boots left tracks that never quite faded. Food remained thin. The last of the jerky was gone in many homes. Root cellars, opened after months of rationing, revealed little more than sprouting potatoes and onions, soft with rot. Some families boiled the soft ones anyway, mixing them into thin soups that filled bowls more with steam than substance. Others turned to neighbors, trading tools, or labor for a small sack of grain. In these weeks, survival was not only about enduring the weather, it was about cooperation, trust, and sometimes pride swallowed in the face of hunger. Yet amid hardship, there was also wonder. The prairie, for all its flooding, began to stir with life. Geese returned, their honking cries carrying across the open sky. Shoots of green pushed stubbornly through mud. The sound of rushing water, though dangerous, also carried the promise of spring's renewal. Settlers stepped outside, breathing air that, for the first time in months, carried warmth instead of frost. But danger was never far. Some cabins sat too near the rivers. Families scrambled to stack belongings higher, carrying tools, food, and quilts to lofts above. As waters licked the edges of floors, horses were led to higher ground, hooves splashing through rising currents, their eyes wide with fear. Cows were driven up slopes, mooing in protest but moving steadily, guided by hands that knew hesitation could mean loss. In those days, survival became a race against the river. Every decision mattered. Stay too long, and the water might rise beyond control. Move too soon, and you risked abandoning shelter before safety could be guaranteed. Families prayed not just for warmth, but for stability, for the ground itself to hold firm. Evenings brought exhaustion, but also a strange kind of hope. Families gathered around smaller fires now, not for survival against cold, but for comfort against damp and uncertainty. Mothers hummed familiar tunes, their voices softer, tired but steady. Fathers spoke not only of past summers but of the work to come, plowing fields, planting seeds, repairing fences. Children listened, eyes wide, clutching the same wooden toys carved during the long winter. The prairie had shifted from white to brown, from frozen silence to rushing noise. Winter's battle had ended, but spring's trials had only just begun. And through it all, the settlers endured, holding fast to the belief that every flood recedes, every storm passes, and every hardship carries within it the seed of renewal. By the first days of May, the prairie was no longer buried in white. Patches of green began to spread across the land like brushstrokes of hope, timid at first, then bolder with each passing day. Grass pushed through mud. Buds swelled on trees that had stood black and brittle all winter. Birds returned in flocks, filling the air with songs that settlers had almost forgotten existed. After months of silence, the sound of life was a shock. as though the earth itself had suddenly remembered how to breathe. Yet survival was not simply guaranteed by the turning of the season. The thaw revealed the cost of winter. Fences had collapsed under snowdrifts. Roofs sagged with damp rot. Tools left outside were rusted or broken. Wagons, unused for months, groaned when finally moved from frozen ground. Every family looked around at their land and saw not just promise, but endless work. Worse still, the bodies that had carried them through the cold were weary. Children, pale and thinner than they had been in autumn, lacked the strength to run freely even in open fields. Mothers bore hollow eyes, worn from months of careful rationing and sleepless nights by the fire. Fathers, once proud and strong, moved stiffly, their joints aching from constant cold, their muscles weakened by meals too small to rebuild what labor had consumed. Illness crept in quietly. The damp air and melting ground carried fevers that spread from one cabin to the next. Coughs rattled in the night, echoing through thin walls. A simple chill, easily endured in summer, now threatened lives already weakened by hunger. Families brewed bitter teas from dried herbs, hoping to coax warmth and healing into fragile bodies. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Still, the settlers pressed on. Fields had to be cleared, soil broken, seeds planted. Hunger did not wait for strength to return. Men harnessed thin horses, urging them across muddy rows, while women scattered the first grains of corn and wheat. Children followed behind, carrying small bags of seed, dropping kernels carefully as if each one were treasure, and in truth, it was. A successful planting meant hope. A failed one meant despair. The prairie itself seemed to conspire with both kindness and cruelty. Warm winds dried the ground, making planting possible. But rains soon followed, heavy and relentless, washing seeds from shallow furrows, flooding low fields already softened by melting snow. Families rushed to replant, bending over muddy earth, hands raw, faces streaked with both sweat and rain. Every day was a gamble with weather, and every storm felt like a personal test of will. Evenings carried a bit different rhythm than winter. Fires still burned, but now they were smaller, their light no longer the only barrier between life and death. Families sat together, weary from the day's labor, but conversations shifted. They spoke less of hunger and cold, more of what they might build, what they might repair, what they might finally see grow. Children, though weak, began to laugh more often, their voices blending with the chorus of frogs and the rush of swollen streams outside. Yet no one forgot what winter had taken. Graves, small and freshly marked, stood on hillsides. Not every cabin saw the return of spring with the same number of voices that had greeted the fall. Those who remained carried grief with quiet dignity, folding it into their daily tasks, speaking of the lost only when silence grew too heavy to bear. Still, hope persisted. It had to. Each sunrise that carried warmth, each blade of grass that grew taller, each seed that took root was a reminder that the world turned forward no matter how harsh the months before had been. The settlers of 1880 knew that winter would come again someday, but for now, the fight was behind them. Ahead lay the chance to rebuild, to plant, to dream, and to live. And as families lay their heads down on spring nights, still tired, still hungry, but alive, they carried with them the unshakable truth that they had endured one of the harshest winters the prairie had ever known. By the time spring truly settled over the prairie, the settlers of 1880 had already proven something to themselves, and perhaps to history. They had faced a winter so severe it nearly stripped the land of life. They had burned the hay meant for their animals. They had rationed food down to scraps. They had slept with frost on their blankets and woken to breath curling like smoke in the air. And still, they endured. The story of that winter was not just about hardship. It was about choices made in silence, sacrifices unspoken, and the strength that comes only when survival is the only option. It was about mothers who stretched a handful of flour into a meal, fathers who split the last rail of a fence for the fire, children who played with wooden dolls and whispered stories of summer because hope was the only warmth they could give. What makes the winter of 1880 remarkable is not the cold alone. It is the resilience of ordinary people who refuse to let the cold define them. Their names may not all be written in books, their cabins long gone, their fences rebuilt and lost again to time, but their endurance lives on in the memory of the land itself. Step outside on a late winter morning today, and you can still feel it if you listen closely. The wind that once howled through cracks in log walls carries a whisper of those families. The fields that now grow tall with corn once held graves, cabins, and footprints in snow deeper than fences. Every spring flower that breaks through prairie soil is a quiet echo of that survival. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. Life is fragile, but hope is stubborn. Cold may bend the body, but it cannot always break the spirit. Hunger may hollow the stomach, but it cannot starve out love, memory, or faith. In the end, those settlers did not just survive a winter. They gave us a story of resilience, one that still matters. Tonight, as we close this journey through the winter of 1880, carry that lesson with you. Whatever storms you face, whatever cold winds press against your door, remember that warmth can be found in the smallest ember, the quietest song, the gentlest hand held in the dark. So, take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders. Feel the quiet comfort of your own space, your own walls, your own fire. No matter how small, you are safe. You are warm. And as you drift into rest, let this story remind you that even in the hardest of seasons, hope endures. Good night, my friends. Sleep well.